I have two barracks bags at San Pedro to take home. I'd have brought a Jeep home, but I didn't have a wrench to take it apart. Consequently, I had my Jap rifle, bayonets, and various other things. And so they just dump you out on the street and say, go home. So I happened to fortunately have a friend that was Harvey. His name was Harvey Bailing, and he was a motorcycle officer at Montebello Police Department in Southern California. And so I called him. He came and picked me up and took me to his house for 3 days because during the war they had taken our house out and put a freeway in there. So after I was there at his house for a couple of days, I went up to Herbert Street to take a look where our house used to be, and there was a fence, and I looked down to the freeway. So I decided to check across the street and found out that Bob Rush was in the Merchant Marines, and he was home, and he works and he was a fireman now. And across was Don Bowman, and Don and his folks I knew ever since I was a kid. His mother had passed away. He did not go into service because he had a very bad heart. And so he was working for some company, and he was married and had a couple of kids. And so I then went around to come down from the north side of Herbert Street because I knew everybody on the street. There was Queenie and Elsie, and they either, during this 3-year period that I was gone, they either moved, got married, things changed. But see, we think that we could just come back home and everything was the same. It's not. So I said, well, I'll go down and check Tony. He was in my class. He lived two houses up. He had a very bad eye, so I figured he'd never go into service. Well, they did take him in service, and I heard he was killed in the China-Burma area. So it was very disappointing and to hear that all these changes were taking place. Now, my folks had to move out to Hinckley, California, out in the Mojave Desert. That's 12 miles out of Barstow, out in the Mojave Desert, out to Grandpa's ranch because there was no housing that was available. So that's where I ended up, in Hinckley, California. It was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. So while I was in East LA on Herbert Street and didn't find any of my friends, so I decided to call Betty, my girlfriend, who I really loved, and she loved me, and I'm sure we would have planned to be married. And I talked to her sister, who said she had come down with a cold, got pneumonia, and passed away, and she was only 22 years old. And so that really made me feel very sad, and I still think about her often. So anyway, I stayed with Harvey for a few more days and decided that I needed an automobile. Well, I had purchased bonds, so I had saved some money. So he had a 1940 Packard coupe, and I bought that from him. It was really nice. And so I drove that to Hinckley, and my mom was very happy to see me, and I was very happy to see her. And they lived on a ranch right across the street from PG&E, the famous cancer capital. And consequently, this was late in the afternoon. My mom was cooking supper. My youngest brother, Ralph, came home from high school. So he had a car in the yard, so I went down and lifted up the hood so he couldn't see me, and then he walked in and I surprised him. And then we went in the house together. Ma was cooking, and my dad was in the workshop, and he did not even say hello to me. My dad and I had a strained relationship, and he also gave my mother a bad time. So I was home for a few days to a week, and went to Barstow and looked up Ramon Arredondo, which we'd known each other for ever since we were kids, and he was in the infantry in the Philippines also. So he had just bought a brand new Mercury black with a yellow top. It was beautiful. So we were able to wear our uniforms for 30 days after discharge. So naturally, I didn't have any civilian clothes. I didn't feel comfortable at that time to put civilian clothes on. So we put our uniforms on and went to Barstow, walked down the street, and out of Barstow is the Marine base. So here comes all these young Marines. Did we walk off the street? No, they walked off the street. It is funny how you react to where you're at in the time of your life. So anyway, we're dear friends for years, and so I decided that we were allowed to get 3 months of not unemployment. It's called something else, so that we could go find a job or something. So I could see that my dad and I were not getting along, and he was giving my mother a bad time. So I figured it's time to go rent a house and take my mother and my 2 younger brothers and move, which we did. And then as we settled in there, then it was time to go look for a job. So we drove 10 miles down Highway 58 to Barstow, and right on the corner of First and Main is Highway 58 and 66. And there was a giant standard station that was totally covered with a huge roof. And they did more gasoline business, 90,000 gallons a month, even with the old cars. So we applied for a job, and Ralph and I, my youngest brother, we became Standard Oil Company salesmen. We had our little white uniforms and black ties, and we were trained to come to the car and say, "Yes, sir. May we fill your tank, sir?" Then we'd wash the windows, etc. This went on for a year. I did fine. Ralph stayed there, become assistant manager, and he stayed with Standard for 10, 15 years. They built him new stations, etc. During that year, I spotted a little house I wanted to buy. So I went to the Bank of America, and Mr. Savage was the financial CEO of the bank. And I told him I'd like to buy this house. It was $14,000 for me and my mother and the family. And I looked very young for my age. I think I was 23 at that time. And so he said, "Well, what do you have for collateral?" I didn't even know what that word meant. So naturally, I didn't get any loan or any support or any encouragement from Mr. Savage. Thank you, Bank of America. So I then, after a year, Harvey Bailing said, "Why don't you come down to LA and apply for a position and become a motorcycle officer," which I did. Los Angeles Police Department, I was a special officer motorcycle, and we did a lot of traffic control, parades, and escort service. And there was a big, out of the Hollywood studios were on a big strike. They were burning and breaking windows and doing all kinds of stuff. So Harvey Bailing and Howard, another motorcycle officer, and I had the night shift. So we would patrol around and keep things quiet. And then at 3 o'clock in the morning, I was then directed to go pick up the director because his life was threatened, so I was his bodyguard. And then we got in. We I went to his home and escorted him out to his limo and back to the movie studio. And then they lined up the studio because they were shooting out in the valley. So we took him cross town out in the country so that people wouldn't disturb their function as a movie studio. So this was at Hollywood and Vine, and I used to go to the Palladium, and at night, midnight, the nurses would get off at the hospital and come by and bring us coffee and donuts, things like that. So it was very interesting. So as a motorcycle officer, I had a 1974 overhead Harley, just black and white naturally. I loved that motorcycle. Put a lot of mileage on it. And after a year, then I decided to move back to Hinckley, where my mother and two younger brothers were. And I decided then my eldest, my brother Ray, he was a rural route mail star contractor, so he delivered mail many miles in the desert from Barstow to all the way out to Hinckley and out to Trona. Not Trona, out to a desert community called Four Corners. And so he had quite a route, and his car continued to break down because in those days there were not a lot of good automobiles available during the war. So I had a friend that had a brand new Ford available, and it cost $1,200. So that was a lot of money. So we bought that. It was a 4-cylinder. I drove it from East LA to Hinckley, where my brother used that to deliver mail. And my mother worked at the Hinckley School in the cafeteria, and she was the supervisor and ordered all the surplus food from the federal government program. And her philosophy was all these little kids in her school probably didn't have breakfast, nor did they have a hot meal. So she and her staff would just cook like crazy and feed these kids all they could eat, and so they'd be nice and healthy. And she put together on Thursday, she'd mix up like a fruit cake, and I guess they're still doing that at the they were still doing that until they closed the Hinckley School because of PG&E and all that cancer program that happened.